Hey guys, welcome back to Friday at Fran's. My name is Lydia. I am here with you today to share one of my favorite projects at the moment, super simple canvas tote bag. I have been using these puppies every day when I come to work because I have a ton of mess to carry in with me, so I just whipped a few of these up for myself and figured I would share. So I'm going to point out the beauty of these bags, and this is the reason they make such a good gift option too, is that every single seam on the inside of this bag is finished, so you are not going to see any raw edge anywhere in this project. So I am going to go cut my fabric and we will get started. Now we're going to talk about what to cut out for this project. It's very straightforward. You only need a few pieces. You're going to need 2 of these main panels cut out at 18 by 19. The main panels are going to be going long ways, so that 19-inch side is going to be going vertically for your main panel. And you'll see listed in your directions for step number 1, I'm going to want you to cut out a 2 by 2 inch square on each of your bottom corners. Now I have already done that for this piece. You can do that in whatever way you want with rotary cutter, scissors, whatever. But your 2 main panels are going to be looking like this when you're ready to sew, just on the bottom corners. So aside from that, you're just going to need 2 straps cut at 4 inches by 30 inches a piece. You can cut them longer or shorter than 30 inches. That is just the measurement that I prefer for my bags. And then you're also going to need 2 strips cut at 17 by 2.5 inches. That is our back facing, but I'm going to talk about those a little later on. All right, so we're ready to sew. I have my 2 main panels that I was talking about earlier with the 2 bottom sides cut out with the 2 by 2 squares from earlier. I am going to keep the 2 panels wrong sides together, so that means you're going to be looking at the pretty side for this first step. And I'm going to have my machine set to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I am just going to sew up the 2 sides and the bottom in between the 2 squares with that 1/4 inch stitch. That's what I'm going to do right now. So I just sewed up the 3 sides, the 2 sides and the bottom, with that 1/4 inch stitch with my pretty side facing out. So I'm just going to flip this now so that I'm looking at my wrong side of the bag. And I'm going to take this over to the iron and press all of my seams flat. I'm going to roll them out a little bit like this if I need to, so that seam is hanging out right on the very edge where we want it. All right, so I just went over to the iron and pressed all of my seams nice and flat. So I'm looking at the wrong side of my fabric here, that's my right side. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew around everywhere that I already sewed, so the 3 bottom sides, but this time I'm going to do it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And in doing that, that's going to catch the seam that we just sewed so that we get a nice, pretty finished edge from the outside. And make sure to do some nice back stitches at the beginning and end of each of these stitches. I just sewed those side seams up in the bottom again with that 1/2 inch seam allowance. And by doing that, it gives me a nice finished outside, and the interior of my bag will have a nice finished French seam as well. So what I'm going to do now is we're flipping this back out. So we're looking at the right side here. And I'm going to be dealing with these 2 little square corners that we cut out earlier. Now, normally when I say match those seams in the middle, I would tell you to have them facing opposite directions to reduce bulk. But because the draw of this bag is having a nice finished interior, I'm going to have you line up these seams so that from the inside they are both facing the same direction. And that will make a little bit more sense later when we have the interior of this bag all sewn up. So I'm just going to pin that seam in the middle and sew straight across it with the wrong sides together so you can see the outside of your bag right now. And I'm going to sew this up with a 1/4 of an inch stitch. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I am matching my seams in the middle. And for the second corner, check inside to see which direction your seam is already facing on the bottom, and just make sure that it is matched on this second side that we're doing, just so that it's not twisted on the bottom or it looks a little weird when your bag is finished. So again, I am just matching my seam in the middle, and I'm making sure that both seam allowances from the last step are facing the same direction. And it's going to feel just a little bulky, but nothing that is unmanageable. So I'm sewing up this second corner with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so this is our bag as it stands right now. We just sewed up these bottom corners with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm gonna flip my bag out so I'm looking at the wrong side. Get my corners poked out and ready. Now, this is what I was talking about before. It's a little easier to see now. My seams are facing the same side when I match those corners up together in the middle. Now, I'm just going to cheat a little bit and finger press the seam for this step, but it would probably be a good idea for you to give it a quick press at the iron before moving on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch my seam allowance back to 1/2 inch for this step like we did before, and I'm just going to sew straight across both corners again and do a really nice sturdy back stitch, just so our bag is nice and structurally sound. You're going to need the 2 bag facing pieces. I have them matched up pretty sides together, and what I'm going to do, I'm making sure my machine is set to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance for this next step, and I'm just going to sew up both of these short ends on either end. I have my bag facing here where I sewed up both short ends, and then I was over at the iron. I pressed those nice and flat, and on the bottom raw edge I pressed that up 1/2 inch all the way around. So I'm gonna grab my bag right here, and I'm gonna have the facing the pretty side of my bag, and on the top I'm just gonna match up those seams that I pressed open and pin those. And I'm gonna pin a few more in the middle here. While I'm doing this, I will mention that it is very important that your seam allowances are accurate for each step in this project, because a lot of these pieces are cut specifically with that 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch in mind for everything to fit pretty well together. So make sure those are on point. So I'm just gonna take off this front part of my machine, and I am gonna sew all the way around this circle with 1/4 of an inch seam. All right, so I have that sewn at 1/4 of an inch. So all I have to do now is take this and flip it towards the inside of my bag. Now, from this step, it's a little easier if you just go ahead and take this entire bag, flip it to the wrong side so that the facing is on the outside here. So I'm just going to take this over to the iron, roll my seams out if I need to, and press it flat all the way around. So I have my bag ironed now, pressed nice and flat all the way around the top. And while I was over at the iron, I went ahead and grabbed my strap pieces, the 2 4x30 inch pieces. So when you take them over there, it's going to say to fold it in half, wrong sides together. So you'll do that all the way down, and then you'll open it back up to meet that crease in the middle, fold it in half again, and you will end up with a strip all the way down that looks like that. And then for the end pieces, once you do that, I folded mine in about 1/4 of an inch, and then I clipped both of my corners very carefully, and that's just going to reduce some of the bulk inside there. So 1/4 inch down, clip your curves, corners, and then fold it back in on itself, and that will give you a very nice clean edge for your strap pieces. So next on my agenda is I am just going to very carefully stitch very close to the edge all the way around this bag facing. What I did is I pushed my needle all the way over to the far left, and I'm going to line it up on my left edge of foot, edge of fabric with the edge of this facing. Now be careful when you sew this stitch because it will be visible on the outside of your bag. So just make sure you're using a bobbin color that meshes pretty well with the outside of your bag, and just take extra care doing this step. All right, so now that that's done, it's gonna look like this from the inside, and from the outside you can see that stitch kind of all the way around the top edge. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take those strap pieces from earlier, and I'm just gonna top stitch them very close to the edge all the way down this long open side and on both short ends. And I'm gonna do that for both pieces. All right, so there's only one step left to finish up this bag, and that is to put our straps on. So I found a marking pen. I'm a really big fan of the friction ones that we sell here in the shop. They're erasable with heat. But I found a ruler and I measured 3.5 inches from either side of my bag going inwards on both sides to mark my strap placements. And I used that facing stitch that we sewed earlier to measure how far down to pin my straps onto the bag. Now, if you've never seen a box stitch before, that is a good picture of one. That is what I'm gonna sew on the bottoms of all of my straps to make sure that they're really attached to the bag. Now, you can kind of hopefully see a little bit of an outline from where I went ahead and drew one on for myself, but I'm just gonna very carefully stitch out that X and then sew the square around it as neatly as I can. And that's gonna happen for each of the straps on the bag. All right, so I have just finished up sewing the box stitches on my bag straps, and that means that you are finished with your bag. So this is a good close-up of what mine looks like finished right there. If you don't want to do the box stitches, you could also just do a nice heavy stitch on the top and the bottom, reversing a few times, and that would make it pretty sturdy. So you will be able to find written instructions for this bag on our website, fransewingscircle.com, and I will join you next time for Friday at Fran's. Thanks for watching.